She had stood beside him for 11 years. She had smiled through every insult, swallowed every humiliation, and never once raised her voice in this house. But tonight, Vivian Moretti looked her dead in the eyes and called her worthless in front of 200 people. And Roman didn't say a single word. They threw her out in the rain with one suitcase and the clothes on her back. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman walking away in the dark owned the bank that kept their entire empire breathing. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who needed you most, like this video, drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The lake was black and still, the way expensive things always seem to be. Quiet on the surface, cold all the way down. Lake Tahoe in late October had a way of making everything feel permanent. The mountains held the darkness in. The stars above the water didn't flicker so much as burn, distant and indifferent. And the Moretti estate rose against the tree line like something that had always been there and always intended to stay. Evelyn Hawthorne Moretti stood at the window of the second-floor guest suite and watched the cars arrive below. They came in long columns, black sedans, armored SUVs, a few old-money town cars that belonged to men who didn't advertise their wealth because they didn't need to. Valets in white gloves moved between bumpers. Security teams swept the perimeter in pairs. From up here, the whole procession had the hushed choreography of a funeral. Everyone dressed beautifully and pretending not to be afraid. She pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass and watched a man she recognized step out of a silver Mercedes. Lorenzo Battaglia, head of the Chicago outfit. She'd last seen him 3 years ago at a fundraiser for a hospital that neither of them actually cared about. He'd shaken her hand that night and forgotten her face by the time his dessert arrived. Most men in that room had. That was fine. That had always been fine. She turned from the window and looked at herself in the mirror above the vanity. 38 years old. Brown hair she'd stopped fighting with a flat iron 2 years ago, now pulled back with 2 pins she'd found at the bottom of her travel bag. A dark green dress, cut conservatively, chosen specifically because it wouldn't draw the kind of attention that generated commentary. Small pearl earrings her mother had given her before everything between them became too complicated for gifts. She didn't look like money. She never had, and she'd worked at it deliberately. From downstairs came the sound of orchestral music, the low collision of voices, the particular timbre of powerful men performing ease. Evelyn exhaled slowly through her nose and picked up the small clutch from the vanity. Her phone was inside. She'd already silenced it, though she could feel it vibrating intermittently against the fabric. The New York office, probably, or Marcus Chen, her chief financial officer, who had the nervous habit of texting in threes. She would deal with it later. She went downstairs. The estate's main floor had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers threw warm amber across white tablecloths and arrangements of dark flowers, dahlias, anemones, that Vivian Moretti had selected personally because she considered herself a woman of taste and wanted the room to reflect it. The dining room had been opened fully to the terrace, and beyond the glass doors, heat lamps glowed orange against the night chill. Servers circulated with trays. A string quartet played near the bar. Roman stood near the fireplace in a charcoal suit that fit him the way only bespoke things do. Like it had been built around him specifically, which it had. He was 51, but looked younger in the way that hard men sometimes do. Like the years had compressed rather than softened. Dark hair graying at the temples, jaw like a ledge. He was laughing at something Lorenzo Battaglia had just said, and the laugh was real. Roman had a talent for making laughter seem genuine, even when it was a calculated performance. He saw Evelyn cross the room, and the laugh didn't stop. He lifted his glass in her direction. A small acknowledgement. She nodded back and kept moving toward the bar. This was their choreography in rooms like this. They had perfected it over a decade. She ordered sparkling water with lime and positioned herself at the edge of the room, near a window that faced the lake. From here she could watch without participating, which was her preferred mode at these gatherings. She had learned early in her marriage that the people in rooms like this said more when they thought no one important was listening. She had learned equally early that no one in Roman's world considered her important enough to guard their words around. That too had always been fine. She recognized most of the faces. The Battaglia contingent from Chicago, 6 men and 2 women, all well-dressed, all precise in the way that people are when violence is their primary vocabulary and they've learned to code it in manners. Two men from the DeLuca network in New Orleans she'd met at a previous gathering. She remembered that the taller one, Francis DeLuca, wore a pinky ring that had belonged to his grandfather and grew visibly irritated when anyone failed to notice it. Near the terrace doors, a cluster of politicians and their intermediaries stood slightly apart from the crime families, comfortable in the proximity to power, but maintaining just enough physical distance to preserve deniability. And then there was Vivian. Roman's mother moved through the room the way a cold front moves. Everything shifted slightly when she entered a space. Temperatures dropped a degree. Conversations tilted toward her without people quite realizing they'd turned. She was 72 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never been told no in a context where it mattered. Silver hair pinned perfectly, a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, diamond bracelet on her left wrist that Evelyn knew had been a gift from a man whose name was never spoken in polite company. Vivian had hated Evelyn from the first dinner she'd attended as Roman's girlfriend, 8 months before the marriage. She had been impeccably civil about it for 11 years, which was its own particular form of cruelty, the kind that left no marks you could point to. Evelyn watched her move through the room and felt the same thing she always felt watching Vivian, a clean, almost clinical recognition. This woman would do whatever she had decided to do tonight. Vivian Moretti did not gather people for celebrations. She gathered them for demonstrations. The question was what kind. Roman appeared at Evelyn's shoulder around 9 o'clock. He smelled of cedar and something darker underneath. The scent of him she'd memorized and never entirely stopped responding to, despite everything. "You're doing the wall thing," he said quietly. "I'm observing." "Same thing?" He stood beside her and looked out at the room. "Lorenzo's in a good mood. The Chicago business is resolved." "Good. The DeLucas are pushing for the refinancing conversation again. I told Francis we'd discuss it this week." He glanced at her sideways. "You could try to look like you're having a tolerable time." "I'm having a tolerable time." She took a sip of her water. "This is my tolerable face." He almost smiled. For a moment she could see the man she'd married, not the careful public version but the private one, the one who made coffee badly and read in bed with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and sometimes, rarely, said something honest. Then someone called his name from across the room, and the moment closed like a door, and Roman turned away. Evelyn looked at the lake. It was 40 minutes later when Vivian struck. She didn't do it quietly. She never did anything quietly when an audience was available, and she had assembled a particularly good one tonight. The dinner had concluded. The tables had been cleared. The room had reached that post-meal density where people were standing, moving between groups, refilling glasses, and the background noise had risen to a level that required slightly raised voices and leaned-in heads. Nearly 200 people, the full assembly of every significant name in the Moretti constellation, criminal, political, and financial. Vivian stood near the center of the room and raised her voice just enough. "I'd like to say a few words about the family," she announced, and the string quartet trailed off because the quartet knew who was paying them, and the room's attention swung toward her the way a compass needle swings toward north. Roman turned from his conversation with Lorenzo. Evelyn, still near the window, felt something tighten in the base of her sternum. She recognized the particular straightening of Vivian's spine, the way she stood when she had already decided how something would end. "The Moretti name," Vivian said, projecting with the confidence of someone who had never needed a microphone, "has stood for strength, for loyalty, and for the careful selection of who carries that name." She paused and let the room absorb that. Then she turned and looked directly at Evelyn. "Which is why, as a family, we have reached a decision that has been a long time coming." Evelyn didn't look away. The room was very quiet now. "Evelyn Hawthorne has been a part of this family for 11 years, Vivian said. Her voice was smooth and precise, each word placed like a stone in a wall. And in those 11 years, she has given this family nothing. No children, no connection, no contribution that befits a Moretti wife. She paused again. When she spoke next, there was something almost gentle in her delivery, which was the most dangerous register Vivian possessed. She has never belonged here. The women who stand beside great men must be great themselves, or at least understand greatness. Evelyn has always been, a brief considered pause, ordinary. Someone in the room made a small sound, Others were very still. Ordinary in her appearance, ordinary in her ambition, ordinary in everything she has brought to a family that has never been ordinary. Vivian held Evelyn's gaze. My son deserves better. This family deserves better. And so tonight, we are returning Evelyn to wherever ordinary women belong. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who are witnessing something that hasn't happened yet finished happening, who are caught between the act and its consequence, suspended in the moment before everything becomes real. Evelyn stood at the window with the sparkling water in her hand and felt the 200 pairs of eyes move to her face. She thought about what she was feeling. She was feeling it, she realized. She'd expected to go numb, had prepared for numb in the quiet part of herself that had sensed this gathering had a shape to it. But there was no numbness. There was a clean, hot, specific pain, the kind that comes not from surprise but from confirmation, from having suspected something terrible for long enough that when it arrives, you are devastated not because you didn't see it coming, but because some part of you had still hoped you were wrong. She looked at Roman. He was standing 12 feet away, between Lorenzo Battaglia and two men from the De Luca network, and he was looking at the floor, not at his mother, not at Evelyn. The floor. His jaw was tight. She could see it from here. The specific tension in the set of his jaw that she had learned over 11 years of sleeping beside him and watching him in difficult rooms. He was holding himself still the way he always held himself still when something was happening that he had decided not to stop. He had known. She understood that in the same moment she understood everything else. He had known Vivian was going to do this tonight. He had stood beside her at that window 40 minutes ago and talked about the De Luca refinancing, and he had known. She set the sparkling water down on the windowsill. Two of Vivian's security personnel, men she didn't recognize, which meant Vivian had brought them specifically for this, had hired them outside the household staff, stepped forward from positions near the terrace doors. One of them was holding a suitcase. Her suitcase. Brown leather, the one she'd packed for this weekend. They had gone through her things, packed them, brought them down here. The deliberateness of it landed in her chest like a flat stone dropped in cold water. I expect the paperwork will be straightforward, Vivian said, addressing the room rather than Evelyn now, as though Evelyn had already become an administrative matter to be resolved. Roman will provide for the transition, of course. We are not a family without generosity. That word, generosity, was delivered with a particular nuance that made at least 3 people in the room shift their weight. Vivian had a gift for making language do double work. Evelyn walked across the room. She did it deliberately, not quickly. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flee. Not slowly enough to seem theatrical. She walked at the pace of a woman who had decided where she was going, which was the most dignified speed available to her right now. People parted as she moved. She didn't look at their faces. She didn't need to. She could feel the room, the mixture of discomfort and prurient fascination and the specific satisfaction that some people in some rooms take from watching someone else fall, even people who would be horrified to admit they felt it. She stopped in front of Roman. He raised his eyes from the floor. They found her face, and what she saw in his expression was something complicated. Guilt and grief, and something harder underneath it, the resolute blankness of a man who had made his decision and was refusing to revisit it even now, even with her standing in front of him. Roman, she said, just his name. She wasn't asking him to stop it. She wasn't begging. She was giving him one moment to be something other than what he was choosing to be tonight. He looked at her for 3 seconds. 4. The room held its breath. Then he looked away. Evelyn absorbed that. She let it move through her completely, the full weight of it, the finality of it. And then she turned and walked to the man holding her suitcase, took the handle from him with a steady hand, and continued toward the front door. Behind her, she heard Vivian's voice resume smoothly, addressing the room about other matters. The pivot was immediate and seamless, which was the most insulting part. That Evelyn's removal could be accomplished and moved past in the same breath. That the space she'd occupied for 11 years could close over her exit without a visible seam. The front doors opened onto the estate's grand entrance, and beyond it, the driveway curving through manicured grounds down toward the main gate. The October night hit her immediately. It had been raining for the last hour. A thin, cold rain that was barely more than mist, but sustained and pervasive, the kind that soaks through a person gradually, without the drama of a downpour. She stood on the front steps for a moment. The sound of the party was muffled behind her. Below, the remaining valets glanced up from their positions and then looked quickly away. On the driveway, in a line near the gate, were her options. The Uber she would have to call, the cold she would have to stand in to wait for it, the specific indignity of summoning a car on an app while wearing a dark green dress in the rain outside the house that had failed to be her home. She set the suitcase down and opened her clutch and found her phone. 7 texts from Marcus Chen. 2 missed calls from the New York office. 1 voicemail from a number she recognized as the executive board's direct line. A number that was only used for matters that could not wait. She called the voicemail. She listened to it. It was 43 seconds long. When it ended, she lowered the phone and stood in the cold rain for a moment with her hand at her side. Then she called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. "Evelyn, where are you? I'm in Tahoe," she said. "I'm going to need the car." "Which one?" "All of them," she said. "Send the convoy." A brief pause on his end. Then, "How soon?" She glanced back at the lit windows of the Moretti estate. Inside, the string quartet had resumed. Through the glass, she could see the shapes of people moving, continuing, consuming, the party reconstituting itself over the space where she had been, as though she had never taken up space at all. 20 minutes, she said. She ended the call and stood in the rain and did not cry. Not because she wasn't capable of it. She was, and the feeling was there, enormous and precise and fully formed. She didn't cry because she had learned a long time ago, in a world that predated Roman Moretti by decades, that tears were information, and you didn't give information to people who had already decided it wouldn't matter to them. The rain came down steadily. She waited. 19 minutes later, she heard them before she saw them. The low, layered sound of multiple high-performance engines moving through the mountains at controlled speed. Then lights appeared at the bottom of the estate's approach road, cutting through the rain, and the convoy turned into the drive. 4 vehicles. Armored Mercedes Maybach lead car. 3 black suburban support vehicles behind it. They moved with the unhurried precision of things that don't need to rush because nothing challenges them. They pulled up in a line in front of the estate's entrance. The rear door of the lead Maybach opened. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out. Not a driver, something closer to a chief of staff. A man named Daniel, who had worked for Hawthorne National Bank for 16 years, and who Evelyn trusted with the category of things she trusted very few people with. He crossed to her through the rain with an umbrella, and she was obscurely touched by the gesture even though she was already wet. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said. Her name. Her real name, the one she'd carried since birth, not the one she'd borrowed for a decade. "Daniel," she looked at him. "What's the status on the Meridian accounts?" "We've received authorization from the board to proceed. Chairman Ashworth has been briefed. They're waiting on your confirmation to initiate." "Tell them to hold until I'm in the car." She picked up her suitcase. Daniel moved to take it from her. She let him, this once, and she turned toward the Maybach. At that moment, the Moretti estate's front doors opened behind her. She heard them, but she didn't turn around. She heard footsteps on the stone steps, hesitant, then faster. She heard Roman's voice, not calling her name, just a sound, something without words, the kind of sound a person makes when the thing they decided not to stop has already gone past stopping. She got into the car. Daniel closed the door. The interior was dark and warm and smelled of leather and that particular quality of silence that comes with serious sound insulation, the silence of things built to withstand pressure. The rain on the roof was barely audible. Through the tinted window, she could see the lit facade of the estate, the valets who had stopped pretending not to watch, and the blurry shape of Roman standing at the top of the steps in his charcoal suit with his hands at his sides, getting wet. He looked smaller from here. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to Daniel and said, "Tell the board it's confirmed." He relayed the instruction into his earpiece. The Maybach moved. The convoy fell in behind it, smooth and inevitable as a tide. At the gate, the security personnel moved aside without being asked. Of course they did. These were not vehicles that waited for gates. The estate disappeared in the rear-view mirror. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat, and looked at the ceiling of the car and let herself breathe. Just breathe. The careful management she'd maintained all evening, the calibrated stillness, the disciplined walk across that room, the decision not to look at anyone's face, all of it had cost something. And she allowed herself to feel the cost now, privately, in the dark, moving through the mountain rain toward wherever she decided to go next. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She already knew who it was before she looked. The cascade had already begun, somewhere in the intersection of finance and fear, in the place where Roman's empire had been quietly connected to her world without ever knowing it. She knew what was already moving, what systems were already responding to the confirmation she'd just given Daniel, what the morning would look like for a man who had stood in his mother's house and looked at the floor while his wife walked out into the rain. She didn't open the message yet. She closed her eyes and thought about Roman's face when he'd looked up from the floor. That specific, terrible expression, the grief inside the decision he'd already made and refused to unmake. She had loved him. She wanted to be precise about that. Even now, in the accounting she was doing in the back of this car, she had loved him genuinely, the real version of him, the private version, the man who made bad coffee and said honest things rarely, and who had, in the early years, looked at her with a quality of attention that she had never taken for granted because she understood how unusual it was from people who came from his world. She had loved him. He had allowed something to be done to her in front of 200 people because his mother had decided it should happen, and he had valued his mother's judgment above the 11 years she had given him. Those two things were both true. She was not going to collapse either of them into something simpler. Her phone buzzed again and again. She opened her eyes and looked at the rain on the window, the dark shapes of pine trees moving past, the occasional distant glitter of the lake below the road. She thought about the voicemail she'd received. She thought about what the board's call meant for the week ahead, for the decisions that would need to be made at a level that had nothing to do with Roman Moretti and everything to do with the institution she had quietly, systematically built into one of the most powerful financial entities in the country. She thought about Vivian standing at the center of that room, saying ordinary with that careful gentleness. Evelyn exhaled once, long and controlled. Then she straightened in the seat, picked up her phone, and opened her messages. Marcus had sent a cascade of updates over the last hour, time-stamped at intervals that told her he'd been tracking something closely. She scrolled through them with practiced speed, the kind of reading she could do sideways and fast after 20 years of processing financial intelligence, the skill of identifying the load-bearing sentence in a paragraph of noise. The picture that emerged was one she had half anticipated but still felt land with weight. The Meridian accounts, a cluster of financial structures that Hawthorne National Bank had quietly operated as a kind of invisible scaffolding beneath a significant portion of the Moretti organization's legitimate and semi-legitimate business holdings, had flagged an anomaly 3 weeks ago. Marcus had brought it to her attention then. She had looked at it and understood what it meant, and she had made a decision to wait, to see what else was going to happen, to give the situation time to reveal its shape. Now its shape was clear. She scrolled to the final message from Marcus and read it twice. Then she dialed him again. "The full audit," she said when he answered. "Start tonight. I want the complete exposure mapped by Monday." "Evelyn, I know." She watched the rain on the window. "Do it clean. I want every contact documented, every transaction on record, everything traceable. We do this exactly right." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "Are you okay?" She considered the question. Outside, the mountains held their cold and permanent shapes against the dark sky, and the lake was somewhere below them in the blackness, deep and still. "I'm functional," she said. "That's enough for tonight." She ended the call and looked out at the passing dark. The car was warm. The convoy moved steadily. Somewhere behind her, in a glittering estate above a lake, the Moretti family was still celebrating something they thought they'd won tonight. By morning, they would begin to understand the difference between winning and inheriting consequences. By morning, the first of the credit lines would go quiet. But that was morning. For now, the road wound through the mountains, the rain fell without drama or declaration, and Evelyn Hawthorne sat in the back of an armored car with wet hair and a dry expression and thought about all the things that were about to change. Not because she had decided to destroy anything, but because the world had a way of rearranging itself when the person who had been quietly holding it steady finally decided to simply, the first credit line went silent at 6:47 in the morning. Roman didn't know that yet. He was standing in the kitchen of the Tahoe estate in the same charcoal suit he'd worn the night before, the jacket dropped somewhere between the front steps and the kitchen doorway, his collar open, his tie gone. He was holding a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk from and looking at the window above the sink, which showed him the lake in early gray light, flat and colorless the way things look before the sun decides what it wants to do with them. He hadn't slept. He'd stood on those front steps long enough to get genuinely wet, soaked through the shoulders of the suit jacket, water in his shoes, and then he'd come inside and sat in the library for several hours doing nothing particularly useful. At some point, someone had put coffee in front of him. He didn't remember who. What he remembered was the way Evelyn had gotten into that car. Not the car itself, though the car had been its own statement. The convoy arriving with the quiet authority of something that had always had the right of way. What he remembered was how she'd moved. The specific quality of her movement as she crossed from the front steps to the open rear door of the Maybach, unhurried, without drama, with the kind of complete steadiness that is not the same thing as calm, because calm implies the absence of feeling, and what Evelyn had been demonstrating was something different from that, something harder, the steadiness of a person who is feeling everything at full volume and has decided that none of it is going to show in her walk. He had called her name, or he'd made a sound. He wasn't certain it had been a word. She hadn't turned around. The door had closed. The convoy had moved. And Roman Moretti, who had not been afraid of anything since he was 19 years old, had stood in the cold rain above Lake Tahoe and felt something open up in the center of his chest that he had no immediate vocabulary for. His phone went off at 6:52. He looked at the screen. Vincent Caruso, his head of financial operations. Vinny called him twice a week, usually at scheduled intervals, usually with the flat delivery of someone reporting weather patterns rather than money flows. Vinny did not call before 7 on a Sunday morning. Roman answered. Talk. We've got a problem. Vinny's voice was careful in a way that telegraphed the problem was not small. The Meridian line is down. Roman turned from the window. Down how? Down as in suspended. The credit facility, the one through the Meridian structure, the whole 42 million. It's been put on administrative hold. I got a notification at 6:47. No prior warning, no communication, nothing. It's just stopped. Roman was quiet for a moment. Who manages Meridian? Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that meant Vinny already knew the answer and was deciding how to deliver it. Vinny. The custodial bank on Meridian, Vinny said carefully, is Hawthorne National. The kitchen was very quiet. Roman set the coffee cup down on the counter. He did it slowly, making sure it was fully on the surface before he let it go, a precise and deliberate action that was the only visible evidence of what was happening in the rest of him. When did you know it was Hawthorne? He asked. We've known for about 2 years that Hawthorne was the back-end custodial on several of our structured credit facilities. It's not something that ever raised flags because they've been completely reliable, rock solid, no interruptions, no inquiries, nothing. Who set it up that way? I don't know, Vinny said. It was in place before I came into this role. I assumed it was a legacy arrangement from the previous. Find out, Roman said. Find out who set it up, when, and what else runs through Hawthorne. Everything. I want a full map by noon. Roman, by noon, Vinny? He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with both hands on the counter and breathed through his nose and looked at the lake, which had taken on a slight brightening in the growing morning light, the gray softening toward silver at the edges. Then he went to find his mother. Vivian was in the east sitting room, already dressed, which meant she had either slept and risen early or not slept at all. The latter was more likely. Vivian Moretti had the stamina of someone for whom rest was a tactical decision rather than a physical necessity. She was sitting with tea and a newspaper, an actual printed newspaper, one of her affectations, and she looked up when Roman came in with the expression of a woman who has anticipated a conversation and decided how it will go before it begins. Sit down, she said. I'm not sitting down. She looked at him over the edge of the newspaper for a moment, then set it aside on the table. She picked up her tea. She was giving him the performance of complete composure, which was what she always gave him when she wanted him to feel that his emotional state was a disadvantage he was voluntarily suffering. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "I need to ask you something." He stayed standing near the doorway because he knew that sitting in this woman's presence, ceded ground, he was not willing to cede this morning. "The Evelyn situation, last night, was handled," Vivian said. "You planned it." "Of course I planned it." She said it without apology or adjustment. "You weren't going to act. You've been not acting for 11 years, Roman. Someone had to. In front of 200 people. Precisely because of 200 people." She took a sip of tea. "Private conversations with you about Evelyn have produced nothing. A private divorce negotiation would have produced something messy and drawn out and negotiated in her favor because you would have let it be. What happened last night was clean and final and witnessed. It was a humiliation. It was a statement." Roman crossed the room in 3 steps and put both hands on the back of the chair across from her, leaning forward, bringing his face close enough that she couldn't perform distance. "You threw my wife out of my house in front of the Battalias and the DeLucas and half the political network of the Eastern Seaboard." Vivian looked at him without flinching. "Your ex-wife," she said, "and those are precisely the people who needed to see that the Moretti family makes decisions cleanly and with authority. Sentiment is not strength, Roman. I taught you that. You taught me a lot of things," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. The dangerous quiet. The register he used in professional contexts when he was finished with the performance and was speaking from somewhere underneath it. "I'm starting to reassess the curriculum." For just a moment, a fraction of a second, something shifted in Vivian's expression. Not fear, something adjacent to it, the recognition of a threshold. Then it closed back over and she was composed again. "You're upset," she said. "That's understandable. It will pass." "My CFO just called me," Roman said. "We have a credit line down. 42 million in available liquidity, suspended as of 6:47 this morning." Vivian blinked. "Which line?" "Meridian. You know it?" "I know of it. It's one of the structured credit facilities from the old network, I believe." "What caused the suspension?" "The custodial bank put it on administrative hold." He watched her face carefully as he said the next part. "The custodial bank is Hawthorne National." Whatever Vivian knew and didn't know, whatever she'd anticipated and hadn't, that name landed differently than Roman expected. He'd been watching for guilt or foreknowledge, some sign that she'd understood the connection and had acted anyway. What he saw instead was genuine blankness, and that was somehow worse because it meant she hadn't known, which meant she had done what she'd done without even understanding what she was touching. "Hawthorne National," Vivian repeated. "Evelyn's family bank," Roman said. "Apparently." The silence in the sitting room was of a different quality now. Vivian set her teacup down. "Roman, don't." He straightened up from the chair. "Don't explain it to me right now. Don't tell me it doesn't matter, or it's a coincidence, or you'll manage it. I need you to sit with what you did last night and understand that you may have put your hand into something you didn't bother to look at first." He left the room. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone and called his lawyer, a man named Arthur Getz, who was responsive at all hours because he was paid specifically to be responsive at all hours, and because the Moretti family's retainer was sufficiently significant that Arthur Getz had restructured his sleeping habits to accommodate it. "I need everything you have on Hawthorne National Bank," Roman said when Arthur picked up. "Who owns it? Who controls it? What its governance structure looks like? And whether the name Evelyn Hawthorne Moretti appears anywhere in its ownership documentation." "Roman, it's 7 in the morning." "Yes, Arthur. It is." A pause. "Give me 2 hours." "1," Roman said and ended the call. He stood in the hallway of the Tahoe estate with the morning light coming through the tall windows at the end of the corridor and thought about the drive from the front steps to the gate, the way the convoy had moved, the way those vehicles had looked in the rain. Not aggressive, not performative, just certain in the manner of things that have never had cause to question their own capability. He thought about Evelyn at the window the night before. "This is my tolerable face." He thought about the 11 years of estate gatherings and family dinners and financial conversations that had happened around her while she sat at the edge of rooms with sparkling water and watched. He started to understand something, and the understanding was not comfortable. By 10 o'clock, Vinny called back with the preliminary map. Roman sat in the library with the door closed and listened as Vinny read through it. The names, the facility numbers, the origination dates, the back-end custodial arrangements that ran through various Hawthorne national structures. He listened without interrupting, which was not his natural mode, but the information required silence to land properly. It was not 42 million. That had been one line. By the time Vinny finished reading, the number was closer to $380 million across 17 separate structured credit facilities, 4 money transfer corridors, 2 offshore custodial accounts, and a series of currency conversion arrangements that had been running quietly and without incident for, in the oldest case, 9 years. Roman asked Vinny one question when he was done. All of it runs through Hawthorne? Not all of it. Hawthorne is the back-end custodian on the structured facilities, but the transfer corridors and the currency accounts run through subsidiaries, financial entities that we now believe are Hawthorne-controlled holding companies. Now believe, Roman said. Who believed different before? Vinny's pause was answer enough. She hit it, Roman said. Not a question. He said it the way you say something when the shape of a thing has become clear and naming it is the last step before you have to decide what to do about it. I don't know if hit is the right. It's the right word, Vinny. Roman ended the call and sat in the library with the financial map on his phone screen and looked at what he'd been standing on for 9 years without knowing it. He'd thought of himself as a man who built things. That was the narrative he carried, the one he'd constructed and maintained over 2 decades of accumulating power. That the Moretti organization's reach was a product of his judgment, his relationships, his capacity for controlled force at the right moments. He'd believed that narrative completely because the evidence had always seemed to support it. Things had worked. Crises had resolved. Money had flowed in the ways it needed to flow. He sat in the library and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that the narrative had always been partially wrong. That at critical junctures, moments he could now map in retrospect, moments when the machine should have seized or collapsed based on its own mechanics, something had quietly kept it running. Something external. Something he'd been too confident to look for because it hadn't occurred to him that someone in his immediate life was running calculations that sophisticated at a scale that significant without once mentioning it. At 11:15, 3 more credit facilities went dark. Vinny texted him. The overseas accounts in Luxembourg are showing access restrictions. Working on it. At 11:40, Arthur Getz called. I have something, Arthur said, and his voice had the particular texture of a man who has found information that is stranger than what he expected to find. Hawthorne National Bank is privately held. It's been privately held for 4 generations. The current sole owner of the controlling interest, we're talking about a 63% ownership stake in one of the 20 largest private banking institutions in the United States, is Evelyn Margaret Hawthorne. A pause. Not Moretti, Hawthorne. She never transferred the ownership into the marital name. She never disclosed it on any of the marital financial documentation I have on record. Roman was quiet. There's more, Arthur said. Hawthorne National's assets under management are approximately $240 billion. The institution has correspondent banking relationships with 47 countries and operates 6 subsidiaries across North America and Europe. Another pause, briefer. Roman. She is the institution. She's not a member of a wealthy family who happens to own a bank. She is the principal architect of what this bank has become over the last 15 years. The growth trajectory since she took operational control it's extraordinary. The financial press mostly doesn't know who she is because she has been structurally invisible. She's been structurally invisible, Roman repeated. Yes. He thought about that word. Invisible. He thought about how hard a person has to work to remain invisible when they are operating at the scale Arthur was describing. And he thought about what it would take to maintain that invisibility inside a marriage, inside a household, inside 11 years of shared life with a man who considered himself perceptive. He thought about the sparkling water, the position near the window, the observing he had called the wall thing. Thank you, Arthur, he said. He set the phone down on the desk and looked at the wall of books in the library. A room that Evelyn had organized, he now remembered, during their 2nd year at the Tahoe property. She'd spent a weekend doing it while he was in Chicago. He'd come back and found it restructured and hadn't asked her how she'd organized it, and she hadn't volunteered the system, and he had never subsequently needed to locate a book that he couldn't find. He sat in the room she had organized and thought about all the rooms she had quietly put in order without being asked, without being noticed, without receiving credit for the structure that made everything else function. At 12:30, Vivian came into the library without knocking. Roman looked up. She was not composed in the same way she'd been that morning. The composure was still present. Vivian Moretti did not lose composure in visible ways, but it had thinned at the edges, become more deliberate, which in her meant something was wrong. "I've been making calls," she said, "and the Battaglia organization is asking questions about the Luxembourg accounts. Francis DeLuca's financial advisor has called twice. Whatever is happening with our credit infrastructure is becoming visible to the network." She stood in front of his desk, straight-backed, but her hands were clasped in front of her in the way they clasped when she was managing something she hadn't anticipated. "We need to address it." "We need to address it," Roman said. "Yes. I can contact—" "Who are you going to contact, Mother?" He said it very quietly. "Who, specifically, are you planning to call about this?" She held his gaze. "Roman, Evelyn owns the bank," he said. "Evelyn has owned the bank for the entirety of our marriage. She has been the back-end financial architecture for a meaningful portion of this organization for 9 years, and she did it quietly, and last night you threw her into the rain in front of 200 people and called her ordinary." He let that land for a moment. "So when you say we need to address it, what exactly is your plan? Call her? Send flowers? Get Arthur to write a letter?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "I didn't know." "No," Roman said. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You decided what she was before you knew who she was, and you've been right about that decision for 11 years in your own head, and so it never occurred to you that you might be wrong." He stood up from the desk. "You know what she said to me once? She said the only people who assume they know everything about a room are the people who've stopped paying attention to it." Vivian said nothing. "She was talking about financial markets," Roman said. "At the time." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Where are you going?" Vivian asked. "Manhattan." He put the jacket on. "I need to talk to my wife." "She's not your—" "I know what she is," Roman said. "I know exactly what she is, which is something I should have known 11 years ago and didn't bother to find out, because I made the same mistake you did." "Monte mai pagiko des." He looked at his mother. For a moment, the thing between them, the decades of loyalty and obligation, and the specific intricate damage that families do to each other, while meaning well and sometimes while not meaning anything at all, was visible in the space between them like weather. "Don't make any calls," he said. "Don't contact anyone in the network. Don't try to manage this. Just don't." He walked out of the library. In the hallway, he passed the window at the end of the corridor, the one that showed the lake. The morning had cleared since the rain. The water was blue now, genuinely blue, and the mountains across the lake were sharp against the sky in the way they get after rain moves through. It was objectively beautiful. He noticed it the way you notice things when the ground has shifted beneath you, and ordinary details suddenly have a strange intensity, as though the world is trying to demonstrate its indifference to your particular crisis. He got into his car at the Tahoe Estate's rear entrance, his own car, no driver, because there were moments when having another person present was not something he could accommodate. He drove south toward the highway with his phone on the seat beside him, and somewhere in the 40 minutes between the estate and the airport, the fourth credit line went quiet, and then the fifth. And when Vinny texted him the update, Roman read it at a red light and felt the scale of what was unfolding settle into him like cold water rising. The private terminal at Reno Tahoe Airport had a waiting area that smelled of recycled air and expensive coffee, and the particular flatness of spaces designed for people who move through them too quickly to care what they look like. Roman sat in a chair near the window with his phone in his hand and watched a Citation jet taxi toward the runway, and felt the specific frustration of a man accustomed to controlling the speed of things, who was currently moving at the speed of commercial aviation logistics. Vinny had sent 6 texts in the last hour. Roman had read all of them and responded to none. The count was now 9 credit facilities suspended, total exposure across frozen and restricted accounts sitting at somewhere north of $460 million. The Luxembourg accounts remained accessible but flagged, which in the language of international banking meant they were still technically functional, but that anyone attempting to move significant sums through them would trigger reviews that Roman did not want triggered. Not right now. Not with the federal attention that the organization had been managing carefully for the last 18 months. He called Evelyn. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voicemail was professional and brief. A recording that gave her name without title or institutional affiliation, which he now understood was itself a choice. He didn't leave a message. He called again. Voicemail again. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the tarmac and understood that she was not going to pick up. Not because she was punishing him with silence, but because she had already moved into a different phase of things, and his calls were not part of that phase. He texted instead, "I need to speak with you. Not about the accounts. About what happened. Please." He stared at it for a moment, then sent it. No response came before he boarded. The flight to JFK was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Roman spent the first 40 in the back of the cabin with a legal pad on the tray table, writing numbers, mapping what he knew against what Vinny had sent him, trying to find the load-bearing structure of the crisis. The specific financial arteries that, if they closed, would constitute actual systemic threat to the organization rather than painful disruption. It was the kind of work he was genuinely good at, the kind of cold assessment of damage that required separating emotion from mechanics. And he was able to do it for 40 minutes before the mechanics kept leading him back to the same place, which was Evelyn, and the emotion made the work impossible. He put the legal pad away. He looked out the window at the cloud cover below and thought about Arthur Getz saying $240 billion in the tone of a man reading numbers that didn't fit the mental file he'd had open. He thought about 9 years. The specific texture of 9 years of shared life passed through him, the way it passes through a person when they are in a plane above the clouds and cannot distract themselves with motion. Not as narrative, not in order, but in fragments. Evelyn at their kitchen table in the Manhattan apartment with reading glasses she'd only worn at home, reading dense financial documents the way other people read novels, fast and without effort. Evelyn at charity dinners saying the exact right nothing to the exact right people for exactly as long as required, and then finding him afterward and saying, "Let's go with the quality of a woman who has fulfilled a social obligation and is now done." Evelyn in the Tahoe kitchen in October 2 years ago, during the crisis with the New Orleans supply chain, when everything had been on the edge of catastrophic collapse, and she had sat at the table for 2 days barely speaking while Roman managed the operational side, and then on the third morning she had said, "The exposure is resolved," and he had not asked how because he'd been too relieved to ask, and because he had simply assumed, that she had called a contact, spoken to someone, leveraged some network connection from her family background that had smoothed things over. He had never asked. In 9 years, he realized, looking at the clouds, he had never once asked Evelyn how she solved the problems she solved. He had accepted the outcomes. He had not investigated the mechanisms. That was not love. He understood that now in the way you understand things at altitude, when the distance from everything makes the shapes clearer. That was the behavior of a man who had classified his wife as peripheral, as ambient, as background, and had taken the benefits of her presence and capabilities without applying any genuine curiosity to how those capabilities worked. He had told himself for 11 years that he respected her. He had believed it. He had been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when their actions and their self-image are running on separate tracks, and they never stand still long enough to notice the divergence. The plane descended into JFK at 4:18 in the afternoon. His driver met him at the private terminal. Roman got in the car and said, "Hawthorne National Bank, Manhattan headquarters." The driver pulled out and said nothing further, which was what Roman paid him to do. In the car, Roman's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it anyway. "Mr. Moretti," a woman's voice, measured and professional. "My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm the executive chairman of Hawthorne National Bank's board of directors." Roman's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "Ms. Ashworth, I'm calling as a courtesy," she said. "Ms. Hawthorne is aware that I'm making this call. She asked me to inform you that she is available to meet with you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at our Manhattan headquarters if you'd like to discuss the transition of financial arrangements." The transition. The orderly restructuring of the credit facilities and custodial arrangements currently managed by Hawthorne National on behalf of entities connected to the Moretti organization. We want to handle this professionally and without disruption to the broader financial markets, Mr. Moretti. That is in everyone's interest. Is that what this is about? Roman said. Professional handling. That is what Miss Hawthorne has proposed, yes. I'd like to speak with her directly. A brief pause. I understand. She's asked me to handle the preliminary communication. Tomorrow at 10, if you're available. He looked out the car window at the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, the familiar condensed chaos of it, the stacked highways and industrial waterfront, and the distant downtown skyline going gray in the late afternoon light. He had driven this road 10,000 times. He knew this city the way you know something you have operated inside for so long it has become invisible. Tell her I'll be there, he said. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his lap for a moment. Then Vinny called. Roman answered with, What now? The DeLuca organization just contacted us directly. Vinny's voice had acquired a new tension, the kind that came not from the financial situation, but from something lateral to it, something social, which in their world meant something dangerous. Francis DeLuca wants a conversation, tonight. He's saying he's received information about the credit infrastructure situation, and he wants to understand the exposure before he makes some decisions about what? About some joint arrangements we have with the DeLuca network, Vinny said carefully. The ones that run through the Meridian structure. Roman closed his eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. Who told DeLuca? I don't know. Find out. He thought for a moment. When does he want to meet? He said tonight. He said if we can't meet tonight, he's going to take that as an answer. Roman looked at the skyline. The light was failing, the buildings going dark against a sky that couldn't decide between gray and orange. Somewhere in that skyline, Evelyn was in a building she owned, in a role she'd built over 15 years that he had not known existed. Somewhere in that skyline, the Moretti organization's financial infrastructure was contracting, quietly and completely, like lungs that had decided to stop. Set up the meeting, Roman said. 9 o'clock. Grimaldi's on Mulberry. Roman, are you sure you want to do this tonight? You just landed, you don't have the full financial picture yet, and DeLuca is going to come in with 9 o'clock, Roman said. He arrived at Grimaldi's at 8:53. The restaurant was closed for the evening to anyone who hadn't been invited. That arrangement had been made by a phone call between 2 staff members who understood their employer's requirements and didn't require explicit instructions. The main dining room was set with 1 table, 2 chairs, bread and olive oil, a bottle of wine that nobody was going to drink in quantity. It was theater, but it was the necessary theater of these conversations. The physical arrangements that communicated seriousness and privacy, and the mutual understanding that whatever was said in this room would not leave it. Francis DeLuca arrived at 9:02. He was a large man, Francis, broad through the shoulders, running to heaviness in his 60s, with silver hair and a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and had healed in a slightly different configuration. He wore a dark suit and the pinky ring with his grandfather's seal, which Roman glanced at and away from in the right sequence. Francis noticed. Francis always noticed. They shook hands, sat down. A server poured water and disappeared. Francis picked up the bread, broke a piece, set it on his plate, and didn't eat it. He was buying himself 3 seconds, Roman recognized, which meant he was going to say something he'd decided to say before he arrived and wanted to deliver without it seeming rehearsed. You should have called me, Francis said. I'm calling you now. It's not the same thing. Francis looked at him steadily. You should have called me before you made family decisions that affect the financial infrastructure that my organization relies on. The financial situation is being managed, Roman said. Is it? Francis tilted his head, a gesture that managed to be both mild and pointed. Because what I'm hearing, and I'm hearing this from 3 separate sources in the last 6 hours, Roman, 3, is that Hawthorne National has suspended or flagged the credit facilities it manages for Moretti-connected entities. And I'm hearing that this is connected to some family situation that happened last night, he paused, in front of a room full of people that included some of my people. Roman kept his face quiet. It was a personal matter. It stopped being a personal matter, Francis said without raising his voice, when the personal matter turned out to have a $240 billion bank attached to it. Roman said nothing. Francis picked up his piece of bread and ate it now, unhurried, chewed, set the rest down. How long have you known? About Hawthorne? I became aware this morning. This morning, Francis repeated it with a flatness that communicated precisely how he felt about that answer. Your wife, your former wife, I suppose, has been the back-end financial infrastructure for a significant portion of this network for the better part of a decade, and you became aware this morning. Yes. Roman. Francis said his name the way an older man says the name of a younger man who has done something that cannot be undone and must now be looked at clearly. I like you. I want to say that before I say the rest of this. We have done good business for a long time, and I have a genuine respect for how you've run your organization. He folded his hands on the table. But what happened last night was a catastrophic mistake. Not because of the sentiment. I don't care about the sentiment. Because your mother made a public decision about a private matter without understanding the financial architecture. And now that architecture is coming down, and the people in that room last night who are connected to the same financial structure are now exposed. I understand the situation, Roman said. I don't think you fully understand my situation, Francis said. He said it quietly. Precisely. The way men in his position say things they want remembered. I have 2 facilities running through the Meridian structure. If those facilities freeze, fully freeze, not just flag, I have a problem with some commitments I've made to people in my network who will not be understanding about delays. He looked at Roman directly. I need to know how you are going to fix this. I'm meeting with Hawthorne's executive chair tomorrow morning. That's tomorrow. Francis sat back slightly in his chair. Tonight I need to know what I should tell my people. Tell them the situation is being addressed. That is not an answer. It's the answer I have right now, Francis. Roman held the other man's gaze. I'm not going to make you a promise I can't guarantee tonight. What I can tell you is that I am handling this personally, and that I will have something concrete to tell you by noon tomorrow. Francis looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant was very quiet. Outside, Mulberry Street made its usual nighttime sounds. Voices, a car horn, the ambient noise of a city that doesn't adjust itself for the conversations happening inside its buildings. Noon tomorrow, Francis said. Noon tomorrow. Francis considered this, then nodded once. The minimal nod of a man granting time he's not certain has been earned. He pushed his chair back and stood, straightening his jacket, and Roman stood with him. They shook hands again. Francis held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. Roman, he said, the woman in that room last night, when she got into those cars. He paused, seeming to organize something. I watched her walk out. I've been in this business for 40 years. I know the difference between a woman who's been defeated and a woman who's been released. He let go of Roman's hand. You should think about which one you saw. He left. Roman stood in the empty dining room of a closed restaurant and felt the truth of that land in him like a stone dropped from height. He drove back to the Manhattan apartment, his apartment, the one in the West Village that had been theirs and was now technically still jointly owned, one of the details that Arthur Getz would need to manage. And he walked into the entrance hall and stood in the dark without turning on the lights for a moment. The apartment had her presence everywhere in it, not in the decorative way that people describe when they mean someone has chosen furniture. It had her presence in structural ways, in the organization of the bookshelf in the study, in the filing system in the office, in the particular configuration of the kitchen that meant everything was where you would logically need it to be. He'd lived in this apartment for 7 years and used all of these systems without once thinking about who had built them. He turned on a lamp, found his way to the study, sat down behind the desk. His phone showed 31 messages. He looked at the names and didn't open any of them. He opened his laptop instead because he needed to see it with his own eyes, needed to go beyond what Arthur had told him and what Vinny had mapped and what Francis had implied, needed to find the primary source and look at it directly. He searched Hawthorne National Bank. He found their corporate filings. He found their annual reports, the public versions, documents he'd had no reason to search for before today because the name had not been part of his world in any active sense, had been a distant background detail of Evelyn's family history that he'd never examined closely. He read for 2 hours. At 12:40 in the morning, he put the laptop down and leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the study. The ceiling had a hairline crack in the plaster near the light fixture, running diagonally toward the east wall. He had never noticed it before. He noticed it now because he was sitting in the exact position that made it visible, slightly back, head tilted, a position he had never been in before in this chair. in this room, in 7 years of using both. He thought about all the things you failed to see from the positions you always occupy. He picked up his phone and looked at his text to Evelyn from that afternoon. "I need to speak with you. Not about the accounts. About what happened. Please. Delivered. Read at 5:23 p.m. No response. He put the phone face down on the desk. At 1:15 in the morning, it rang. He turned it over. The number was a 212 area code he didn't recognize. He answered, "Mr. Moretti." A man's voice, younger than Ashworth's, precise in the way of someone accustomed to conveying information clearly at any hour. "My name is Paul Reeves. I'm calling from the office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York." The room was very still. "We understand you're in Manhattan this evening," Reeves said. "We'd like to arrange a conversation at your earliest convenience. In the interest of full transparency, we are in the early stages of reviewing financial documentation that has been provided to this office voluntarily by Hawthorne National Bank, related to certain credit and custodial arrangements. We thought it would be appropriate to reach out to you directly before proceeding further." Roman kept his breathing even. It was the only thing he kept. "Voluntarily," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the hairline crack in the plaster, the diagonal line that he'd spent 7 years in this room without ever seeing. "When would you like to meet?" he said, and his voice came out steady, professional, the voice of a man who had not just felt the floor open beneath him, but the floor had opened, fully and completely, and what Reeves was telling him, in the careful language of federal attorneys who say everything and nothing simultaneously, was that Evelyn had not merely stepped away from the financial architecture that supported his organization. She had handed the blueprints to the people who built the walls around it, and Roman Moretti, for the first time in his adult life, was standing in a room with no exits he could see and no move he could make that did not cost him something he could not afford to lose. He didn't sleep. He sat in the study until 4 in the morning with the lamp on and the city making its nighttime sounds outside the window and the phone on the desk in front of him. And he did the thing he had trained himself to do in genuine crises, which was to stop reacting and start mapping. Not the financial map. Vinny had that. Not the legal map. Arthur Getz had been roused from sleep at 1:30 and was already running contingency analysis from his firm's offices in Midtown. The map Roman needed to build was the one that existed in the space between those two things, the territory where financial exposure and legal exposure overlapped and created a third kind of exposure that was harder to name and more dangerous than either one alone. He wrote on the legal pad: names, structures, sequences. He drew lines between things. He crossed lines out when they led to positions that were untenable and redrew them toward positions that were merely catastrophic. At 3:40, he arrived at a configuration that was survivable, narrowly, conditionally, requiring several things to go right in sequence. And he sat with it and turned it over and looked for the weaknesses. And the weaknesses were there, but they were manageable weaknesses, the kind you could work with. The configuration required Evelyn, not her forgiveness. Not her withdrawal of the documentation she had provided to the Southern District. He understood, with a clarity that had cost him a sleepless night to achieve, that both of those things were gone, that the federal involvement was now a separate river running its own course, that whatever Evelyn had given Reeves's office, she had given with full understanding of consequence, and that asking her to take it back would be both futile and, on some level he was still working through, wrong. What the configuration required was a structured transition. The financial architecture had to be unwound in a controlled sequence rather than allowed to collapse. Because collapse didn't just hurt the Moretti organization. It hurt every entity connected to the Meridian structure. It hurt the DeLuca network and the Battaglia-adjacent businesses and the 17 legitimate companies that had been using Hawthorne National's custodial services without knowing who ultimately controlled those services. Collapse was a disaster for everyone. A controlled transition was a disaster primarily for him. He needed Evelyn to choose the controlled transition. At 9:45 the next morning, he walked into the lobby of the Hawthorne National Bank building on Park Avenue and felt it register in him the way a physical object registers. Weight, dimension, the particular quality of space that money builds when it has decided to become architecture. The building was 43 stories of glass and pale stone, understated in the way that things are understated when they don't need to announce themselves. The lobby had the proportions of a space designed for calm. High ceilings, natural light, materials that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The art on the walls was serious without being aggressive. The staff moved with the contained efficiency of people who were good at their jobs and knew it. Roman gave his name at the reception desk. The woman behind it, young, precise, the particular kind of composed that is trained rather than natural, confirmed his appointment without a visible reaction to his name, which meant either she didn't know who he was or she did and had been instructed not to react, and he suspected the latter. He waited 4 minutes. Then a man he didn't recognize appeared and introduced himself as James and escorted Roman to an elevator that required a key card and rose to the 38th floor without stopping. The 38th floor was different from the lobby, still understated but denser, the understatement of a working floor rather than a reception space. The particular atmosphere of a place where significant decisions were made by people who had been making significant decisions for long enough that they no longer needed the decisions to feel significant. Bookshelves. Conference rooms with glass walls showing people at tables with documents. Assistants moving between offices with the focused speed of people who understood that their time was a secondary resource. James led him to a conference room at the end of the corridor. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, a window that showed Midtown Manhattan in flat November light. Sitting at the head of the table was Claire Ashworth, 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of face that had decided, at some point in the last decade, that it was done performing warmth it didn't feel. Beside her, a man Roman identified as Hawthorne National's general counsel, and on her other side, a woman he didn't know. Evelyn was not in the room. Roman sat down across from Ashworth. James closed the door behind him and remained standing near it. "Mr. Moretti," Ashworth said, "thank you for coming." "Where's Evelyn?" "Ms. Hawthorne will join us shortly. She asked me to begin the preliminary discussion." Ashworth opened a folder on the table in front of her. "We'd like to propose a transition timeline for the credit facilities and custodial arrangements. 60 days for an orderly wind-down, during which time we would maintain current service levels to avoid market disruption. We would work with your financial team to identify replacement custodial arrangements, and—" "I want to speak with Evelyn," Roman said. Ashworth looked at him. She had the particular patience of a person who has anticipated an interruption and decided in advance that it will not alter the course of the conversation. "I understand. She will be here. In the meantime, we'd like to use the time productively." "Ms. Ashworth." He said it without heat, without aggression, with the flat directness of someone who has decided on his approach. "I'm sure you're very good at what you do. I'm sure this transition timeline is well constructed. I'm not going to discuss it with you before I speak with Evelyn, and that is not a negotiating position. It is simply the order in which I am willing to have this conversation. So whenever she arrives, we can begin." A short silence. Ashworth closed the folder. "I'll let her know you're ready." She stood, and the general counsel stood with her, and they went out. The unknown woman remained, which meant she was not legal counsel. She was something else, an observer, a recorder of some kind. Roman didn't ask. He looked at the window. The door opened 11 minutes later. Evelyn came in alone. She was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a gray jacket, her hair down in the way she rarely wore it at formal occasions, which he suspected was deliberate, a signal that this meeting occupied a category other than formal. She looked rested. She looked, he thought, like herself, not the estate-gathering version of herself, the one who stood near windows with sparkling water, but some other version he was still calibrating, the one who had gotten into an armored convoy in the rain and said all of them when asked which car she wanted. She sat down across from him. The woman in the corner was still there. Evelyn glanced at her briefly and said, "Rachel, could you give us the room?" It was not a question. Rachel gathered her notepad and left, closing the door. They sat across from each other in a room high above Manhattan with November light coming through the glass, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Roman looked at her face. He was looking for the thing he'd seen in her expression across that ballroom in Tahoe. The grief inside the steadiness, the specific human damage of the moment before she'd turned from him and walked away. He couldn't find it. What he found instead was something quieter, and in its way, more devastating. The expression of a person who has moved through the acute phase of something and come out the other side into a different kind of clarity. She had not come here angry. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Anger, perhaps, or the performance of professional distance, the armoring of feeling behind institutional language. What she'd brought was neither. She was simply present, in the way that people are present when they have stopped managing how they appear to the other person in the room. Roman, she said. Just his name. The same way he'd said hers in that ballroom, he realized. Just the name, containing everything that didn't have another form. I should have called you before I came, he said. I should have... He stopped. Started differently. I should have done about 50 things differently. I don't know where to begin with the list. Then don't begin with the list, she said. Say what you actually came here to say. He looked at her. I came here to apologize. That's the first thing. Before the financial conversation, before the transition timeline, before any of it, I came here to tell you that what happened in that house was wrong. And I knew it was wrong while it was happening, and I didn't stop it, and there is no version of that which I can explain or justify. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She called you ordinary, Roman said, in front of people who will tell that story for the rest of their lives. And I stood there. He felt the words as he said them, felt their specific texture, the inadequacy of language for the thing he was trying to describe. I've been trying to understand why, what I was, protecting or preserving, what the calculus was. He shook his head. The honest answer is that I don't have one. I stood there because it was easier than not standing there, and that is the worst kind of cowardice because it doesn't even have the dignity of being a real reason. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I know why you stood there, she said. Do you? You've been afraid of her your whole life, Evelyn said. Not physically, the other kind. The kind that doesn't have a name because men in your world aren't supposed to have it toward their mothers. You've been afraid of her disapproval since you were a child, and you've built an empire that is partly, not entirely, but partly, a structure designed to earn something from her that she decided before you were born she wasn't going to give. The sponge. She paused. I knew that about you when I married you. I thought it would resolve itself over time. That was my mistake. Roman was quiet. My family was never the problem, Evelyn said. The problem was that you believed I deserved respect only after you learned I owned something powerful. It landed the way she'd probably known it would land. Not as an accusation, as a fact delivered without cruelty, which made it more difficult to receive than cruelty would have been. He could defend himself against anger. He had no defense against precision. That's true, he said. I know it's true. I'm not here to argue with it. He put both hands flat on the table. I'm here because I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I am asking it as whatever I am to you now, not as someone making a business proposition. He looked at her directly. The transition, the 60-day wind-down that Ashworth described. I need it to be structured carefully, and I need it to be structured in a way that protects the entities that aren't mine. The businesses connected to the Meridian structure that aren't Moretti operations. There are 17 of them. Most of them are legitimate. Some of them are small. If the wind-down is disorganized, if the credit facilities collapse instead of transitioning, those businesses go under. Evelyn said nothing. She was listening. I'm not asking you to protect me, Roman said. I understand what you gave the Southern District. I'm not asking you to take it back. Whatever comes from that, I'll manage. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to protect the 17. The people who aren't me. The silence in the room was complete. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read it. Couldn't find the emotional architecture of her expression. Couldn't tell if she was moving toward the answer he was hoping for or away from it, and the not knowing was its own particular punishment. I was already going to protect the 17, she said finally. He exhaled. One breath. Involuntary. The transition plan Ashworth presented has a structured protection mechanism for third-party entities built in, Evelyn said. I wrote that section myself 3 weeks ago when I began to understand that the situation at the estate was moving toward a conclusion. She looked at him with the flat clarity of her eyes. I knew something was coming. I didn't know the form it would take. I started planning the transition then. Roman absorbed this. 3 weeks ago. Yes. You'd been planning an exit for 3 weeks. I'd been planning a responsible exit, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her, this woman he had shared 11 years in a bed and a table and a life with, and understood that she had been running calculations he had never imagined, at a level of sophistication he had never applied to her, with a care for consequences that extended to people he hadn't thought to care about. And she had done all of it quietly, without credit, without even the satisfaction of being seen doing it. Evelyn, he said, and his voice came out different than he'd intended, rougher, stripped of the professionalism he'd brought into this room. I need you to know that I am not a man who admits that he was wrong easily. You know that about me. I know that about you. I was wrong, he said. Not about one thing, about the fundamental, about what I thought you were, about what I thought our marriage was, about what I thought I knew. He looked at his hands on the table. I built an empire. I thought I built it. I spent 20 years telling myself that story, and you sat beside me the entire time and knew the truth of it and never said a word. I wasn't protecting your pride, Evelyn said quietly. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't staying quiet to preserve your ego. I was staying quiet because I loved the man underneath the ego, and I was hoping, for 11 years, that he would surface often enough to make it worth staying. The past tense of loved sat in the room between them like an object. Did he? Roman asked. Surface enough? Evelyn looked at the window. At Manhattan, in its flat November light, the buildings filling the sky, the city that neither of them had built, and both of them had operated inside as though they owned it. Sometimes, she said, in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, when you thought no one was watching, when you were tired enough to stop performing, she looked back at him. Not enough. In the end, not enough. He nodded. He didn't argue it. There was nothing to argue. His phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen. Vinny. He turned it face down. The federal meeting is tomorrow, he said. Arthur thinks if we cooperate fully on the financial documentation, the exposure on my end is... He stopped. Looked at her. I'm sorry. That's the other conversation. It's a real conversation, Evelyn said. You don't have to apologize for having it. Can I ask you one more thing? She waited. The documentation you gave them. The financial records from the Hawthorne side. He kept his voice even. Was it everything? The pause was brief. It was everything relevant to the structured facilities and the transfer corridors. I didn't give them anything that goes beyond the financial arrangements, operational matters, things that don't touch my institution. I didn't include. Why not? Because I'm not trying to destroy you, Evelyn said. I'm trying to be finished. Roman looked at her for a long moment, at the face he had slept beside for 11 years, the face he had stopped truly seeing somewhere in the middle of those years when familiarity had replaced attention, and the woman in front of him had become furniture rather than a person. And he felt something that had no clean name, something that combined grief and respect and the specific, desolate recognition of a man who has understood too late what he possessed and failed to protect. He stood. Evelyn stood with him from habit or courtesy. The Legacy Alliance Gala, Roman said. He'd heard about it that morning from Arthur, who'd flagged it as relevant, a major financial event, the kind of gathering where Evelyn's appearance would constitute a public statement about her institutional standing. Next week. I'll be there, Evelyn said. I know. He looked at her. I'll probably be there too. She said nothing to that. He picked up his phone from the table, turned toward the door, stopped with his hand not quite on the handle. Evelyn. He didn't turn around. He addressed the door, the pale wood of it, the brass handle. When you were sitting at the window that night, at the estate, before any of it happened, I came and stood beside you, and we talked about the DeLuca refinancing. I remember, she said. Did you know then what was coming? The pause was long enough that it was its own answer before she spoke. I suspected. And you stayed. I stayed, she said. I wanted to be wrong. He put his hand on the door handle and held it and breathed through the thing that moved through him at those words. The weight of I wanted to be wrong, the human specificity of it, the years contained in it. Then he opened the door and walked out into the corridor of the building she owned, past the glass-walled conference rooms and the moving assistants and the serious art on the walls. And he pressed the elevator button and waited. And when the doors opened, he stepped inside and the doors closed behind him, and the elevator began to descend, floor by floor. From the altitude of everything he now understood down toward the lobby, where the city was waiting with its complete indifference to what had just ended in a room above it. His phone went off again. "Vinny," he answered this time. "Tell me," Roman said. "The Battaglia organization just pulled their representative from the Joint Planning Committee," Vinny said. "Lorenzo called it administrative restructuring. It's not administrative restructuring." "No," Roman said. "It's not. And Francis DeLuca's office called. They said he's convening an emergency meeting of the network's Financial Review Committee. Tonight." "Roman." Vinny's voice had the quality it got when the situation had moved beyond the category of problems he was equipped to manage. "If DeLuca's calling a review committee meeting, that means he's going to recommend a restructuring of the network's association with us," Roman said. "Yes." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the pale stone and the calm light and the staff moving with their contained efficiency, and Roman stepped out into all of it and stood in the center of the Hawthorne National Bank lobby, in the building that the woman he had failed had built into one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country, and understood that the thing he'd spent 20 years constructing was coming apart at a speed that no amount of management or loyalty or controlled force could arrest. He stood very still. Around him, the lobby continued its quiet functioning. People crossed the marble floor, a phone rang somewhere and was answered. The city moved beyond the glass doors, loud and certain and ongoing, doing what cities do, which is continue regardless of what any individual inside them is losing. Roman Moretti stood in the center of it and felt the specific quality of a man who has arrived, finally and without the option of leaving, at the moment of complete reckoning, where everything he has built, everything he has protected, everything he has sacrificed is standing on a single point. And the point is not money, is not power, is not the loyalty of men like Francis DeLuca or the approval of a mother who has spent a lifetime withholding it. The point is 38 floors above him, in a conference room, collecting her documents and preparing to walk into a public room next week, and demonstrate, with her simple presence, exactly what the difference is between a person who has power and a person who... The Legacy Alliance Gala was held on the second Friday of November at the Meridian Grand in Midtown. Not the financial structure that bore that name, a coincidence that Roman noticed and suspected Evelyn had noticed too, though she would not have chosen the venue. It was chosen by the gala's organizing committee, which was composed of the kind of people who selected venues based on ceiling height and catering contracts and did not concern themselves with the resonance of names. Roman arrived at 7:45 alone. He had considered not coming. He had considered it seriously, over 3 days of federal meetings and attorney consultations, and the specific, exhausting work of a man dismantling the architecture of his professional life, one structure at a time, the voluntary disclosures, the cooperation agreements, the quiet conversations with men like Francis DeLuca, in which the word restructuring was used so many times it lost its meaning and became simply the sound of things ending. He had considered staying in the apartment or driving upstate or doing anything other than walking into a room full of the people who had watched his world come apart over the preceding 2 weeks. He came because Evelyn would be there, and because he understood, with the kind of understanding that arrives only after you've stopped arguing with it, that there were things that needed to be witnessed, and that looking away from them was the same error he had already made once in a ballroom above a lake and could not afford to make again. The venue's main hall was lit warmly, chandeliers throwing gold across 700 guests, who represented the full cross-section of what the financial world considered its best version of itself. Bankers and fund managers, and the particular category of politician who considers themselves a financial thinker first, and alongside them, the board members and philanthropists and a scattering of press photographers positioned near the entrance who knew which arrivals were worth documenting. Roman gave his name at the door and was admitted without incident. He moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms like this, with the contained authority of a man who takes up space deliberately. But something had changed in the quality of the attention that followed him. He could feel it. Not hostility, not the active energy of people who want to see you fail. Something more neutral, and in some ways harder to be inside. The attention of people who have already updated their assessment of you and are watching to see how you carry the new weight. He found a position near the bar. He ordered scotch, neat, and held it without drinking. He was standing there at 8:03 when the room changed. He felt it before he saw it. The specific shift in a large crowd's attention, the collective reorientation that happens when something at the room's center of gravity has moved. He turned toward the entrance. Evelyn walked in beside Claire Ashworth, and behind them, two members of Hawthorne National's board of directors that Roman now recognized from the financial filings he'd read in the study at 1 in the morning 2 weeks ago. She was wearing black, not the conservative black of someone dressing for invisibility, but a precise, structured black that said she had chosen this garment knowing exactly what it would communicate and had no reservations about the communication. Her hair was down, no pearls, nothing borrowed from the aesthetic of the Moretti world or the world she'd navigated inside it for 11 years. She looked entirely like herself, which was, Roman understood, the point. The room's response was immediate and genuine. Not the performed deference that powerful people receive when they enter rooms where everyone already knew who they were, but something more spontaneous. The response of people who had spent 2 weeks reading about Hawthorne National Bank and the woman who controlled it and were now seeing her in person and recalibrating the story in real time. Financial titans who had previously known Evelyn Hawthorne Moretti as a peripheral name attached to a crime family were now understanding that the hierarchy had been inverted the entire time, and the recalibration was visible on their faces. People rose to greet her. Not all of them, not in a coordinated way, but enough of them, and the right ones. The names that mattered in this room, the ones whose acknowledgement functioned as institutional endorsement, and the effect was cumulative, spreading through the hall in the way that social signals spread in rooms where everyone is watching everyone else to understand what the correct response is. Roman watched from the bar. He watched a man he knew to be one of the 3 most powerful private equity figures in the country cross the room specifically to take Evelyn's hand. He watched 2 senators position themselves in her trajectory. He watched Claire Ashworth step back, naturally and without being asked, to allow Evelyn the center of the space. And he watched Evelyn inhabit that center without performing it, without the self-consciousness of someone who is aware of being watched, or the aggressive ease of someone who wants you to know they're comfortable. She was simply present, fully, entirely present, in a way he was not certain he had ever seen her be in 11 years of watching her manage her presence in rooms he'd brought her into. He understood, standing at the bar with the untouched scotch, that he had never brought her into a room where she could be herself. He had brought her into his rooms, and in his rooms the role available to her had been defined by its relationship to him. And she had occupied that role with a discipline and a patience that he was only now beginning to understand the full cost of. He set the scotch down on the bar. Across the room, Evelyn's eyes found him. It was brief, a second, perhaps 2. She didn't look away quickly. There was no flinching from it, no performance of indifference. She looked at him with the direct steadiness that was her most fundamental quality, acknowledged him with it, and then turned her attention to the person speaking to her. It was not forgiveness. He knew that. He was not looking for forgiveness in it. What it was recognition, the acknowledgement that he was in the room, that he existed in her peripheral world, that the history between them was real and would remain real, and that she had decided to carry it without being defined by it. He thought that was probably the most she could offer him, and it was more than he deserved. At 9 o'clock, the gala's program began. The organizing committee's chair, a man named Whitfield, who had the benign confidence of someone who had never personally experienced financial catastrophe, offered opening remarks and introduced the evening's keynote speaker with the kind of extended praise that functions as its own argument for the speech to simply begin. Evelyn walked to the podium. The room quieted with a speed that was itself a form of respect. She stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled 700 and said nothing for a moment. And the moment was not uncomfortable because she was not using it to perform confidence. She was simply getting her bearings, taking in the room at full scope, the way a person does when they are about to say something they want to say with accuracy rather than effect. "Power doesn't create character," she said. Her voice was even, not loud, carrying in the room because the room had given it the space to carry. "It only reveals the character that was already there." She paused. "I've spent 15 years building an institution whose primary purpose is not to accumulate power but to direct it, to put financial resources in contact with people who will use them to build something real, businesses, communities, families who need a foundation and have never had access to one." She looked across the room steadily. That work is invisible in the way that structural work is always invisible. No one thinks about the foundation when the house is standing. People think about the foundation when the house falls down. The room was very still. I have recently had some experience, Evelyn said, with the moment when people begin thinking about the foundation. A sound moved through the crowd, not laughter exactly. The sound of 700 people recognizing simultaneously that she was doing something precise and controlled and slightly dangerous, and finding it compelling for exactly those reasons. She did not look in Roman's direction. He had not expected her to. The institution I lead will continue to invest in the things that create lasting value, she said. Not power structures, not influence networks, not the machinery of fear, which is always more expensive than it appears and always costs more than the people running it plan to pay. She looked out at the room with her characteristic directness, the expression that was not warm in the performed sense and not cold in the defended sense, but simply clear. We invest in character, because in the end, in every end, character is the only asset that compounds without limit. The applause started before she had finished stepping back from the podium. It built quickly, with the genuine momentum of rooms that have heard something they recognize as true rather than merely well-delivered. Roman did not applaud immediately. He stood at the bar and felt the speech land in him, felt each word of it find the specific place it was designed to find. And then he put his hands together with everyone else, not loudly, not in the front of it, but genuinely, which was all he could offer and which she would not see and which was the right way for it to be. He left before the dinner service. He walked out of the Meridian Grand into the November night, and the city closed over him immediately. Its sound, its cold, its absolute continuity. And he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the traffic and breathed. He had a meeting with Arthur Getz in the morning. The Federal Cooperation Agreement had a preliminary structure, and Arthur believed, cautiously, with the specific caution of a lawyer who has been wrong about federal cases before and does not want to be wrong again, that the voluntary disclosure framework they'd assembled would keep Roman outside of a criminal exposure that could not be managed. What couldn't be managed was the organizational consequence. The Moretti network, in the form it had existed for 20 years, was finished. Not dramatically, not in a raid or a collapse, in the slow grinding way that institutions end when the invisible things that were holding them together quietly stop. 3 weeks later, Roman called a meeting of the remaining senior figures in the organization. He did it in the conference room of a building he owned in the financial district, not in any of the spaces that carried the weight of the organization's history, because he did not want history in the room for this conversation. He wanted a clean table and the clear November light through the windows, and men who understood what they were hearing. He told them it was over. Not in those words. He used the language of transition and restructuring because that was the language they all operated in, and because it was technically accurate. But he said it in a way that left no interpretation available. The organization as it was constituted would not continue. The people in this room had the opportunity to move into legitimate operations, and he would use what remained of his institutional relationships to facilitate those transitions. The alternative was to operate without the financial infrastructure and network protection they had previously relied on, in an environment of increased federal scrutiny, with a depleted reputation in a network that had already begun to restructure around their absence. The men in the room were quiet. Vinny, who was the one Roman trusted most to say the honest thing, said, "You're walking away. I'm changing direction," Roman said. "That's the same thing in our language." "Maybe our language needs updating," Roman said. Vinny looked at him for a long moment, reading something in Roman's face that Roman was not trying to hide. Whatever he found there, it was sufficient. He nodded, once, the small nod of a man who has understood something he didn't expect to understand, and didn't argue further. The others took longer. There were objections, calculations made out loud, the particular resistance of men who have built their identities inside a structure and cannot immediately imagine existing outside it. Roman listened to all of it without impatience because he understood it. He had built his identity inside this structure too, had confused the structure with himself for long enough that dismantling one had felt like dismantling the other. He knew now that they weren't the same thing. That had been the most expensive lesson of his life, and he had learned it in a room high above Manhattan from a woman who had known the difference from the beginning. By December, Vivian Moretti had moved from the Tahoe estate to a smaller house in Connecticut, a move that was described by the family as a choice and understood by everyone familiar with the family as the inevitable reconfiguration of a power structure that had lost its source. She called Roman twice in those weeks. He answered both times and kept the conversation short and did not argue and did not explain, which was the most merciful thing he could offer her, and also, he suspected, the most devastating. She had done what she believed was right for the family. She had operated from the certainty of a woman who had never been required to question her judgments. The world had disagreed with her, comprehensively and without sentimentality, and now she was in a smaller house in Connecticut, understanding that disagreement at the pace that proud people always understand such things. Slowly, partially, and with enormous private cost. He did not call her. He answered when she called. That was the distinction he had decided on, and he held it. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in December that Roman spent in Arthur Getz's office on the 52nd floor of a building in Midtown. Signing documents while outside the windows, the city ran through its ordinary business below them. The settlement had been negotiated by lawyers for 3 weeks, cleanly, without drama, in the professional manner that Evelyn had proposed from the beginning. She took nothing from the Moretti assets. She required nothing. She signed her name on the dissolution documents as Evelyn Hawthorne, using no hyphenation, no second name, returning to the signature that had always been the accurate one. Arthur slid the final document across the desk, and Roman signed it, and it was done. He sat in Arthur's office for a few minutes afterward, in the chair across from the desk, looking at the city through the glass. Arthur gave him the space to sit there, which was one of the things Roman valued about Arthur. He understood when the professional work was complete and the human work was still going on, and that the two required different things from the people in the room. "She's opening a new lending division," Arthur said finally, not because it was relevant to the legal work, but because he'd read about it that morning and understood it was the kind of thing Roman would want to know. Community-focused, small businesses, first-generation entrepreneurs. She announced it yesterday. Roman nodded. "Significant capital commitment," Arthur said. "The press coverage is considerable." "It will be," Roman said. He left Arthur's office at noon and walked for a while, not toward anything, just through Midtown in the December cold, through the particular density of the city in the weeks before the end of the year, when everything is in motion, and the motion has a quality of urgency that is partly manufactured and partly the genuine human response to time running out. He walked south on Lexington and then west, letting the blocks pass, feeling the cold on his face and the specific quality of anonymity that New York extends to people who are not performing their identities, who are simply walking. He stopped on a corner in the West 40s and looked at a storefront that had recently become something new. A bakery, recently opened, the sign still bright. A woman inside moving behind the counter with the particular focused energy of someone in the early days of something they have built themselves. Through the glass he could see 2 employees, a display case, a handwritten chalkboard menu. Small, real, the opposite of invisible. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. Then he kept walking. He thought about what Evelyn had said at the podium. Character is the only asset that compounds without limit. He had turned it over many times since that night, looking for the angle at which it became a comfortable thought, and had not found one. It was not a comfortable thought. It was a true thought, which was different, and the truth of it was specifically uncomfortable for a man who had spent 20 years investing in everything except that particular asset. He was 51 years old. He had the remainder of his professional life, whatever form it would take after the restructuring was complete, and he had the kind of clarity that only arrives through catastrophic loss, which was perhaps the most expensive form of education available and also, in his experience, the most durable. In February, Hawthorne National Bank launched its community lending division with a press event that was covered by 4 major financial publications and 17 regional outlets. The photograph showed Evelyn at a ribbon cutting in the South Bronx, standing outside the First Community Lending Office, a converted storefront on a block that had been waiting a long time for someone to decide it was worth investing in. She was not wearing the structured black of the gala. She was wearing a coat and practical shoes, standing in winter light on a sidewalk, shaking hands with a man who had just secured financing for a restaurant that had been in his family's plans for 15 years. She was smiling in the photographs. Not the managed smile of rooms where smiling is strategic. The other kind. Roman saw the photographs on the financial pages and looked at them for a long time. He had a meeting that afternoon with a woman who ran a nonprofit workforce development organization and needed a financial partner for an expansion she'd been trying to fund for 2 years. The meeting had been arranged through one of the legitimate business contacts he was rebuilding his professional life around, slowly and without drama, in the way that things get built when you have stopped trying to build them quickly. He went to the meeting. The woman, her name was Gloria Reyes, she was 44 years old. She had the practical directness of someone who had spent years making real cases to people who had the resources to help and frequently chose not to, laid out her organization's financials and her expansion plan with the efficiency of a person who has done this presentation many times and knows exactly how much time she has before the person across the table makes their decision. Roman listened. He asked 4 questions, all of them specific, all of them about the operational details rather than the promotional materials. And he watched her respond to the questions with the focus of someone who is accustomed to being asked about the surface and is relieved to be asked about the structure. At the end of the meeting, he told her he was interested in supporting the expansion. She looked at him with the careful expression of a person who has been told this before by people who then didn't follow through. "What does interest mean to you?" she said. "It means I'll have my attorney contact yours this week," Roman said. "And I would like to understand more about the operational side before we finalize anything, because I want to be useful, and I don't want to be useful in ways that look good on paper and don't actually help." Gloria Reyes looked at him for a moment longer. "That's an unusual thing for a person in your position to say." "I'm working on that," Roman said. He drove home in the early evening through city traffic, through the ordinary December light of a city that was still entirely itself, regardless of what any individual inside it had lost or found, or was still in the process of becoming. He thought about Evelyn in the South Bronx in February light, shaking the hand of a man whose restaurant would open because someone had decided his plans were worth backing. He thought about what it cost a person to be that, to be the invisible thing that holds the structure up, for years, without acknowledgement, without credit, without the world understanding what it is standing on, and then to walk away from the invisibility into the full light of what you actually are, not because you wanted the recognition, but because someone had finally forced the question of whether you were willing to keep choosing silence over truth. He thought she had been braver than he had ever understood, for longer than he had ever known. He parked in the garage below the West Village apartment and sat in the car for a moment in the quiet of the underground space, the engine cooling. The sound of the city filtered down to almost nothing. He was not a good man who had made a bad choice. He understood that. He was a complicated man who had made many choices, some of them defensible and some of them not. And the sum of those choices had produced a life that was now, at 51, requiring to be rebuilt from different materials than the ones he'd been using. That was not a tragedy. He had decided that. It was an accounting. Late, expensive, conducted at significant cost to people he had not sufficiently considered, but an accounting, finally, honestly made. He got out of the car and took the elevator up and walked into the apartment and turned on the lights in the kitchen and started making coffee. Badly, the way he had always made it, and stood in the kitchen that still held the organizational logic of a woman who had understood structure better than anyone he had ever known, and drank the bad coffee while it was still too hot, and looked out the window at the city in the dark. Somewhere in that city, Evelyn Hawthorne was finishing her day in a building she had built, at a desk she had earned with the full and unambiguous weight of what she was visible to everyone who cared to look. She was not looking back. He knew that. She had turned fully forward with the completeness of a person who has finished carrying something heavy and set it down and kept walking. And the walking was steady and clear-eyed and unhurried because she had always known where she was going and had only been waiting for the path to be fully her own. Roman Moretti stood in his kitchen and drank his bad coffee and understood, with the full depth that only comes after everything else has been stripped away, that the most powerful person he had ever known had loved him without needing his power, had protected him without requiring his protection, and had left him without asking for anything he had failed to offer. He understood it completely, finally, and too late, which is the particular condition of certain kinds of wisdom, that they arrive only after the moment when they could have changed the thing they illuminate has already passed, leaving you with only the clarity itself, clean and permanent, and of no use to the story that is finished, but perhaps, if you carry it honestly, of some use to whatever story comes next. He rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. The apartment settled into its quiet. Outside, the city continued,